I think the other challenge that law firms have is, as you said earlier, the vast majority of businesses will fully acknowledge and embrace the ethical and moral principle that we have a duty to look after our team and to support our team. Where I think in professional services that sometimes conflicts with other areas is because there's a big demand on performance. So in particular law firms that be faced with increasing expectation from client, and I think probably decreasing loyalty, so that there is a demand that people work harder. Businesses generally, and law firms are no exception, are faced with rising taxes. They're faced with the possibility of a recession. They've got to cling on to clients. We've got a cost of living crisis. There's a greater demand on salaries. So law firms and other professional services businesses, on the one hand, embrace the need to look after the team. But on the other hand, the simple fact of business life is that they have to drive top performance. Is there a conflict there? And if there is, what's the solution?
Well, yes, I think there absolutely is a conflict, and it's a great point. I think it goes back to something I was sort of talking about and thinking about earlier, which is around that walking the talk, if you like. I didn't use those words, but it was the idea of it's all very well saying that something is important, but if the actions are not actually kind of role modeling those principles, then actually what happens is people see that disconnect and almost it fuels the wrong response to that. So it makes it even more difficult to land the ethical importance of well-being when you're not actually walking the talk. I think the idea of performance is fascinating because there's so many different ways you could describe performance. So I think that effort is sometimes shrouded in the guise of performance. You work hard, you work long hours, but are you actually producing the results?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, it's so interesting you said. I think law firms have got a particular problem with this. I mean, I've got friends who are in the corporate world, in legal, and they've made this exact point. That there's always been a culture of long hours in corporate and commercial legal businesses. And I've mates of mine who are partners in those firms. They sometimes make the point that for people just to go home early is frowned upon. And that even if you've got nothing to do, if you're not still in the office at 8 o'clock, there's a cultural issue there. And it seems to me that what businesses actually want is not the behaviour, they want the outcomes. And if someone is able to deliver the outcomes without living by that sort of expected culture, I think that's what needs to be embraced. It's about focused on what it is we need to do. What is it that we need to achieve? What does success look like? And base the culture around that, not the theory that just pure effort or the image of effort is what leads to great results.
Completely. And it's making me think of that whole busyness kind of epidemic, if you like, of how are you? Oh, I'm so busy. Well, yes, you are. Back-to-back meetings, back-to-back Teams calls that we know are having a lot of impact on our brain. There's some fascinating kind of research emerging of kind of, ECGs of brains and what our brain looks like when we've had one call after another call after another call, as opposed to putting breaks in the day, is actually having quite a physical effect on us. And remote work is a whole new dimension for such a lot of us. And it's happened so quickly that we're still trying to understand it and trying to kind of gather the information on it. But this whole idea of presenteeism, working hard, being seen to work hard, and not celebrating that actually that person has produced above and beyond the results that we would ever want. The client is super happy. And they happen today to have finished at 3 o'clock, and they could get home and see their son or daughter in the school play. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's everything right with it, isn't there?
But it's what happens in reality versus what we know to be kind of, it's the mismatch, isn't it? It's the mismatch between those two things. Are you walking the talk?
Definitely. And happy people are more productive. So if you're able to produce both a working environment and a working pattern which is consistent with happiness, and to me, happiness is being able to schedule into your waking day the parts of your life which are important, which include work, they include family, they include social time, they include your hobbies. If you're able to facilitate your team having that schedule, I think you'll benefit in terms of both your working environment, your recruitment and retention, and ultimately how much money you make. So none of these things are mutually exclusive. And that's what I've found anyway.
I completely agree. And when you were talking before about the sort of some of the systemic pressures, we were talking a little bit about how much it costs to kind of fund or put extra funding into support, whether that's through the NHS or whether that's through private healthcare and other ways that privately we can support our employees. The question then comes back to how do we justify that spend? And yes, there's the sort of the moral and ethical kind of parts of that equation. But then there's also this sort of hidden cost of, whether it is to do with actual absence, whether it is to do with the less tangible reduced performance because people are working on 50% of battery, individual battery rather than 100% of individual battery because of kind of overwork, or whether it's simply because retention costs a lot of money, but we never really truly articulate how much it costs consistently. So I was asked to help a client recently to really work on a particular part of their business, professional services business, massively high turnover rate for them, well above what they would normally expect. And I asked them how much they kind of put as a sort of a number on each vacancy or each leaver that each person that leaves the organisation. And they said, well, we usually sort of talk about a third of the person's annual salary. Now, some organisations do a slightly different metric, but somewhere between a third and a half of the year's salary is often actually not a bad measure, because if you think about it, it'll take a couple of months minimum to find somebody, a couple of months to sort of get them on board, a couple of months to get them up to speed. There you've got 6 months. If you then put that person's annual salary in those terms on a piece of paper and say, okay, so if our attrition rate is 25% and we're losing, 100 people on £50,000, then we're actually losing 250. That's just costing us £250,000. If we bring that down from 100 people to 50 people, we've saved £125,000. How much of that £125,000 will it take to actually create the initiatives, the support, the infrastructure and so on to actually kind of open up that saving? And you can start to have some really interesting conversations about how cyclical this is. So when we talk about the NHS waiting list and how much it costs to fund the NHS waiting list, and then we look at the costs that are coming out of all these different reports, PwC, Deloitte, the one that you've mentioned before, but others. There's one today or this week in the Financial Times. These numbers are huge, and it's cyclical, because if we can start to move we can start to move some of the money from one place to the next.